So if you want to follow along, we're on page 18 in your notes, if you still have those. Page 18. Next week, Lord willing, if I have the opportunity, I do want to kind of get into the problem of evil, which is something, remember, Solomon isn't so much questioning the fact that God is able to do things. Sometimes he questions, like, what is happening? Like, why is this working this way? So there seems to be almost a question of God's justice, but intentionally from a human perspective. Like, he's not approaching it trying to be disrespectful. He's being very open as a human. Like, this is stuff we all think about. This is stuff we all go through. So we may get into that issue next week, which would involve a separate handout, but we'll see how that one works out. So if you're on page 18, what we're doing is we are wrapping up chapter 3, moving into chapter 4. Remember, chapter 3 is all about the cycles. So we had that wonderful song that was stuck in our head all during work week, because it's so good, because to everything there is a season, and you just have to turn. So you go through those different cycles. Solomon is basically just saying, like, there are times that God controls, there's times that we control. It's kind of weird to be like, it's just life. Like, that's just what happens. As we get into verse 16, this is where he starts getting into the injustice of things, like the fact that there are things that just don't seem right. It says here, Ecclesiastes 3:16, moreover, I saw under the sun the place of justice, judgment. Okay, so that's like a courtroom or a place like that. I saw the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. And so let's just put it in modern day terms. You think about the institutions that we have in our world today and how we don't trust them at all. We don't trust government to be fair. We don't trust government to be on our side. We don't trust courts to be just. Political favors are the rule of the day. Most churches, we don't really trust, like, there's a suspicion to a lot of things. I know we work with enough churches that we trust those churches we work with, but there's enough skepticism out there in the world of pretty much any institution. And this is the idea. Solomon, he says there's no new thing under the sun. This was written thousands of years ago, and he's saying there's this place of judgment that should be the most upright, fair thing, and it's not. And then there's this place of righteousness. You think like religious services, things like that, where these people should be the most righteous, and they're not. And he's drawing attention to that fact that this doesn't make sense. This seems very wrong. What do I do about it? And he's a king, so obviously he could have probably done some things about it. But he says, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. There is a time, there is a purpose for every work. And so even that is part of the cycle of, sure, I like the way he puts it. He says, because punishment is not executed speedily against a wicked man, his whole heart gets set to do evil. So it's kind of this, if you imagine this idea, Solomon presents, you walk up as a little kid and you got the cookie jar you're not supposed to take from. So you reach in and you take the one cookie, nobody saw you, nobody punishes you, and you're like, oh, I got away with it. Well, you're not stopped from going back and trying to do it again. So you sneak back again into the kitchen, you look around, nobody's around, you steal a cookie. Hey, I've stolen 2 cookies and I didn't get caught. What's going to stop you from taking the third or the fourth or the fifth? I mean, ultimately, you're going to just keep doing it until you're finally caught. And that's what Solomon's trying to say. He says, there are times where God, for whatever reason, says, I'm not going to punish you right away. Like, I saw that, but I'm not going to take care of it at this moment. And so what happens is the heart of this wicked man just becomes completely set to do evil because he hasn't been punished for the evil he's already done. And so Solomon is looking at that situation, and as most of us would do, he looks at a situation where he's like, God, you have the ability to do something about it, but you choose not to. I don't get it. Like, if you had stopped that at moment 1, he wouldn't have come back 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Why didn't you stop it there? Well, if you can go back, there are times, such as with Abraham, where God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go into captivity for 430 years. And part of it is he says, as he continues to expound this to Abraham's descendants. He says, the iniquity of the people of the land is not full. So there almost seems to be with God a sin meter where it will vary based on the group, but there seems to be this sin meter where he's like, you know what, I'm waiting until it gets to this point, and then I'm going to show you how powerful I am. And so he lets it rise, and the rest of us are looking around going, why aren't you doing anything? And he says, just wait, I've got something planned, and he waits for it to hit that point, and at least with the Exodus, that's when he comes rolling out with the Israelites, and he comes rolling out of Egypt, and he says, I just want you guys to know, like, I can take care of the problem with a bunch of slaves. Like, they just come out of the desert, and you know what? They defied me, and I actually didn't let them get that sin meter way up. I decided to cut it off really early for them because they defied me and said, we're not going in the land, we're too scared. So I said, okay, you're going to wander the desert for 40 years. Then your kids are going to go into the land, and they'll take care of this problem. But to hear God talk about the sin problem of the land, it seems to be the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And you're like, huh? And even with Sodom and Gomorrah, if you study out that story, there was a time where these several kings came and they invaded Sodom and Gomorrah, took it over, and Abraham went with his servants, took out those kings, rescued Lot, and then apparently Lot and the people who were rescued went right back into Sodom and started living there again. And so it was almost like a warning shot. I think God does this to places sometimes where he says, I'm not going to lay out the full punishment yet. Like, there are times where I'm gonna fire a warning shot across the bow to say, straighten up. You can learn or not. Sodom didn't. Another city that did was Nineveh. Nineveh, the Assyrians were absolutely terrible. I mean, to the point of you defied if they rolled up on your city and said, we want in, and you said no, when they conquered you, they would, cut you into pieces or leave piles of heads outside the door. Or, there were things where they would just make an example of your city to say, anyone else want to resist us? And so when Jonah heard, I want you to go down to Nineveh, the capital city of this army that does all this brutal stuff, I want you to go down there and I want you to preach repentance. He was like, no, because they might actually do it. And if they actually repent, I don't want them spared. And so what God did is God pulled all these interesting miracles to basically shove Jonah toward Nineveh to say, just tell them what I told you to say, because I still care about these people. I'm giving them a space to repent. And so for whatever reason, God chooses to say, I see that sin, but I'm going to not deal with it at the moment. If I could compare it to parenting, there are even times where as a parent, you see your kid do something, and because you don't want to be riding them every moment of the day, you say, I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. That's what I do. But there are times where my dad used to say it this way, you punish what you see, but you don't have to see everything. I wonder if God, being, our Heavenly Father, so to speak, I wonder if there are times where God says, I saw that, but I'm going to let it go. The great thing about God is he knows the consequences, so he could do things way down the line that we can't predict. So, I mean, you think about the situation with Job and all the good that's come from the story of Job. You think about Jonah with Nineveh and all the good that's come from that. You think about the Exodus and all the good that's come from that because he chose to wait and he chose to show his power at certain times. So to answer Solomon's question, he's wondering why God does things, and he kind of answers his own question by saying, it's part of the cycle. God will get to it, so we need to make sure we're serving God properly. So that's just kind of a quick application here. Verse 18, he says, I said in my heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest in them, that they might see that they are themselves beasts. Now this is where you've got to be really careful to not take Ecclesiastes out of context. Because he says, like, they are beasts. And he starts comparing mankind to beasts to say there's nothing better about man than a beast. He's not saying that. He's saying when you compare the end result of man to the end result of animals, we all die. So What better is there for being a man? He uses the same logic earlier when he talks about the idea of the wise man and the fool. And you can live as wise a life as you want, and you're still going to die. So what better is it? Why is it better to be a wise man? He's speaking under the sun. Okay, so that's where you've got to remember some of that. Now, as you continue through this, again, he is talking this idea of profit. He's talking the idea of cycles. And then, like I said, as you continue down through these texts, he is drawing attention to this truth right here. You need to enjoy what's been given to you. Now, you don't enjoy it to the level of sin, or some of this stuff comes into play. Okay, so he'll say that clearly. He'll say, rejoice in your heart, but just understand God's still going to bring you into judgment for it. That shows up later in Ecclesiastes 11. He is going to do this so man reveres him properly. This is the one time we're actually given the answer to why, and so you can see that previously in verse 14, but we looked at that last week. And so ultimately, God will judge. God will take care of things. So again, Solomon is not questioning God's authority. He's sometimes questioning his justice because he doesn't understand why God waits. And so that's kind of this big thing. He's wondering what's going on behind the scenes. That's where I think Job, insert the whole story of Job, because that's the behind the scenes. Okay, so Solomon may or may not have had access to Job. We don't know which books were written at his time. Job seems to be a very old book of the Bible, but we don't know for sure. So Solomon very well could have had access and probably did, but that gives some of this behind the scenes. Now, man's fate, as we continue here in chapter 3, he is going to explore the fate of man. You guys kind of see that in the text. But again, it is a poetic investigation. Okay, this is not systematic theology. He's not trying to make extremely precise doctrinal statements. So when he says, man is no better than a beast, you cannot take that quote, run over to your systematic theology book, put that inside the doctrine of man and say, man's no better than a beast because Solomon said so. Like, he's waxing poetic, all right? He is talking under the sun. That's why he says things. He says things like man is no better than a beast. I don't know where that accent came from. So again, Solomon is digging into this idea of what matters. What is life about? What should we be living for? And ultimately, he comes back around to this idea of everything you seek to accomplish on a physical realm will die and rot away. So the conversation I had on the airplane recently, where it's the first time I've used Ecclesiastes as an evangelistic tool. It's kind of neat. But to talk to someone who had a $2 million business, okay, and between lawsuits and other things where the business kind of fell apart, to talk to someone who had the big fancy house, who had the fancy car, who could say it's really not worth having. Like, it's just so much more stress, it's so much more work, it's so, and to hear them talk like, I'm just as happy with this car as I am with the big fancy one, and to hear them say, the experts, whoever those people are, but psychiatrists, they say you get about a 6-month buzz out of a really, really nice new purchase. So you get a brand new spanking house and you get about that 6 month, like, woo, and then it kind of wears off, because then you realize what it takes to take care of a big house. But when you have gardeners and workers and all these people working for you and it makes you feel really, really good, but then it wears off. And it's that next big thing you've got to chase. And it's just interesting to hear someone talk. And as you go through their conversation, you're like, have you read Ecclesiastes? Because you are following right along with what Solomon says. Like it was uncanny to hear a formerly rich person who's going through a really, really hard time just rattle off all the things, and you're like, Ecclesiastes. So that's why I was like, you might want to read this. But and she said she would, so who knows? But it was just all of the things that we go after. And it's not wrong to enjoy things, okay? God gives them to us to enjoy. There's nothing wrong with that. Abraham had a whole ton of wealth. Job had a whole ton of wealth. There were many, many very rich people in the Bible. Nothing wrong with being rich. But the Bible will constantly say, don't live for that stuff. Enjoy what you have. But if you live for it, it will not bring lasting pleasure. It's almost the means to an end. It's not the end in itself. So where our culture gets it backwards is they spend all of their time, their health, their energy trying to earn money. And they think the more money they have, the more happy they'll be. Now, ultimately, we all know it's the stuff you buy with money. Yeah. But that's not what we should be chasing after. We live a life of service to God. We live a life of doing what's right, and the pleasure comes with that. And if money comes with that, then you enjoy what you have. It's fine. But then if God chooses to take it away, we have the attitude of Job that says, hey, I didn't bring anything into this world. I'm not going to bring anything out. So whenever I get rid of it, God knows. So now, it's a very hard attitude to have when you start losing everything. But that's how this is playing out. All right? And again, the important thing to remember with all of this, and I keep stressing this, there are times where Solomon is pretending there is no God. He's pretending that there's nothing above the sun. And so he keeps coming back to that idea to say, listen, if there is nothing above the sun, we all go to the same place when we die. It's called the dirt. And who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or downward? Like, who knows? Obviously we know, but that's just, I'm not going to explain every verse in Ecclesiastes, but if you can read through the book of Ecclesiastes and remember some of these key ideas like this, it's going to protect you from making some really, really bad interpretations. So that's how that plays out. Now, we're pretty much done with chapter 3, so we're moving on to chapter 4. But as you do this, Solomon's going to make a few major conclusions in the book. So the first one, we've already kind of dealt with this. Enjoy the life God has given to you, but don't enjoy it for sin. All right, so enjoy the life you've given to you. All right? It's not a kick back and enjoy, it's an enjoy it as you go. So that's one of these first major conclusions here as we wrap up chapter 3. This, like I said, is going to get revisited in chapter 11, I believe it is, where he's going to encourage young men to, hey, rejoice, like enjoy your youth. But just remember that there's certain things that you shouldn't be living for. And so, again, it's just that constant reminder. Now, he is going to deal with injustice a bit. So chapter 4 is a lot of this type of stuff. So he's going to look at a lot of these non-just acts. And so look at chapter 4. It says this, so I returned and I consider all the oppression that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of such as are oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of the oppressor there was power, but they had no comforter. And so when I read this verse, I think of the idea of hurt people hurt people. You know, where it's like you were someone who was wronged, and then you return the favor to the next generation, and then they return the favor to, you know. And it's not a constant cycle. You know, otherwise, anyone who was abused as a child, like everyone would be abused by a child within like 3 or 4 generations if you do the math. So there are people who overcome the damage that they grew up with. But you look at a lot of the people who hurt other people, they were wronged themselves. Like there was wrong that was done, that was not dealt with, and then whatever happened, they ended up doing it to the next generation. So there's hurt on both sides. But you look, and he's saying, I looked under the sun, I returned, I considered all these things. Now this verse almost seems to be taking that under the sun in a slightly different context. That's why I said it's important to read the context. Because as he talks, he says, I considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. So it's almost the idea of like all the oppression that's done here on the earth. You know, like I looked everywhere I could, and everywhere the sun shone, I looked, and I found oppression. And these are the things I found in common. Now, it's still hearkening to this idea of we're still taking God out of the picture a little bit, but you just understand the slight shift in how he's using the term. So I returned and I consider all the oppressions that are done under the sun. Behold, the tears of such as are oppressed, they had no comforter. So he's grieving over this idea that there are people out there who are being wronged and they have no one to help. And then he also looks at the people who are doing the wrong, and he says, and on the side of the oppressor there was power. So yeah, they had the power and they had that authority and they were taking advantage of it, but they also had no comforter. So he's almost feeling bad for both sides. And he says, therefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they, which has not been born, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Again, I considered all travail and every right work, and for this that a man is envied of his neighbor, this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. A fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. And he's he's like, wow, there's just so much going on here. And that's why he's starting to make rather morbid conclusions that the dead are better than the living because of all the badness that happens on this earth. And in fact, it's better to never have been born. And this is a sentiment that comes right out of Job. Because as Job talks, he's like, well, curse the day that they said there was a man-child born, and curse the day. And basically he's saying, I wish I was never born, because even though I've seen great joys, the devastation I'm now living is just, it's not even worth the great joys that I had in my life. Like, this is so bad that the so good doesn't even measure up. It almost makes it worse. And so Job just gets to the point where he's like, I wish I'd never born. Because it's just tough. Now again, it is under the sun. And so let's unpack this. All right. As he continues to talk this issues through, he's going to draw attention to this fact, and I think this plays into our work specifically here. And he says, as hardship comes, a fool is going to ruin himself and basically give up. So as you continue here in Ecclesiastes, what he's going to do is he's going to start talking about the fool. Now, anybody remember how we defined a fool?
Someone who refuses to hear truth.
Okay. So yeah, depending on which type of fool we're dealing with, yeah, someone who refuses to listen to the truth or receive it. So we got three different types of fools. We got the simple man who just doesn't know any better. We've got generically the fool, someone who knows what's right to do and just doesn't do it. And then we've got kind of the extreme level of fool, which is the scorner, which they know what's right to do and they actually intentionally and rather wrongly go against it. So if you kind of think about that. So as you think about a fool, I'm going to be using the definition of this as someone who knows what's right to do and just chooses not to do it. Or someone just not doing the right thing. All right? And so as hardship comes, just look at the text. It's kind of weird. A fool is going to fold his hands together and then eat his own flesh. And it's this idea of like, he's not working. He's refusing to work. His hands are folded, and basically all he's going to have to eat is him. And again, it says, better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. And so he's using some very extreme illustrations to kind of bring this idea of be happy with what little you have, but still go out there and work. And I think this spring is kind of with what we were doing around here is kind of a good example of it. Because we were just working, and if you think about like paychecks, it's like, well, we're not. You work a 40-hour week, you're paid a little bit more than we are. But we were doing it for the delight of working, because there's just something about you just need to work, and that's something Solomon keeps coming back to. So again, he's building that idea of be happy with what you have. Better is you don't need a ton to be happy. You just need enough to keep yourself fed. And he says it's better to have that little bit and have peace. And again, I've known enough richer people who bring a lot of grief on their life because they have to keep having more and more and more. And I'm like, well, you have the nice stuff, but you don't have peace. You just watch. Just do that experiment as you go through life. Look at the people who have a lot of stuff and just ask, are they actually happy? I know some who are very rich who are very happy. They're just unbelievably happy, and that's fine. It's because they're probably not living for their stuff. But I've also known several richer people who they had the nice things, or at least they looked like they had the nice things on the outside. But there's just travail and there's a lack of peace. That's why the Proverbs is going to say, it's better to dwell in the corner of a housetop in peace than in a broad house with a brawling woman. We look at that, we're like, that's sexist. It's okay. But you get the idea. It's the idea of like, man, I've got this massive nice house, but the person I have to live with is absolutely terrible. I'd rather live in a shack because at least I'd be at peace. And that's the point is it's better to be happy with the little bit than to ruin your life chasing after the lot of it. So again, he keeps going, and so the fool is going to be someone who obviously doesn't do this. He says, I returned and I saw vanity under the sun, And this is where he's going to get into this idea. There's another thing here. That we kind of already covered that. But he's going to get into this idea of friendship. So look at verse 8. He says, there is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet there is no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches, neither saith he, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? This also is vanity and sore travail. So you've got this guy who's doing all his work, he has no one to pass it on for, and he just kind of looks at that and goes, that's just sad. It's just sad that you're wasting your whole life earning money that you'll never get to use because you're working all the time. And you'll never get to pass on to your kids to make their life better because you don't have any kids to pass it on to. And that's kind of this frustration, he says. But look what he says, verse 9. Building off of that, he's talking about friendship, and he says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. So you think about all that you could do by yourself, and then you take a second, and now you're working together. It's so much better, pretty much every way. Now, if those two are working together, they have a better reward. You also prevent the situation from the previous verse where if one of them dies, there's no one for the stuff to go to. And so actually you're bettering one of their lives even more if someone dies. That's not incentive, that's just what happened. But then look at verse 10, it says, for if they fall, so he's using the illustration, let's say you're walking down a road or you're doing something and you trip and you fall and you don't have the ability to get back up. If you're alone, well, pity's on you. But if there's someone else there, they pick you back up, you keep going, they fall, you pick them up, and you're actually enlarging the amount of stuff that you can accomplish because there's now two of you. I was just joking with Deb last night because, the kids are sick, and so we're tag teaming a lot of things right now. But I was like, I don't know how single parents do it. Like, I think there'd be times where it's like, you are staying in your bedroom, daddy needs time, and just like lock myself in the other room. I have a feeling that if I were a single dad, that would happen more often than I'd be proud to admit. But I just think about the amount of work it takes to raise kids and the fact that you really do need two people going at it, because there are days where I am completely burned out, and if this child screams one more time, it's just going to be bad. Yeah, and you just, you're just burnt, and then there's other days where you're feeling really, really good, and your spouse isn't, and so you're like, okay, you need to go into the other room for a little while. I'll protect the children today, and it's, but it's a tag team because there's days where I'm that way, and that's the idea of two are better than one, because you don't kill the children. Now that. As we continue to the next verse, this is not a defense of polygamy. Get on verse 2. It says, two are better than one, and it says, for if they fall, one shall lift up his fellow, but woe to him that falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, two lie together, they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And then he's just going through all these illustrations. And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So he's not saying, hey, two parents and three parents. No, he's just using illustrations of, you have certain engagements that are better with more people. And it's better to have friendship because you're there for each other. All right? And so there have been times where people have helped, talk me down from a situation because they're a friend. And who knows what you would do if you were by yourself. As the Bible says, it's not good for man to be alone. Because men are stupid. And then there are times where I've talked people down from things because it's like, hey, I'm thinking right now. This is like the one time. So let me help you. And you're not thinking right, so let me help. And it's two. And then there's times where you pull in a third, and now there's three of you having a conversation about something, and you're now working even better because, one, the third person can be like, no, he didn't say that, which happens a lot. No, you heard that wrong. I was there. That's not what he said. But then there's also the third person can go, oh, you didn't think about this, but let me throw this in. And so there's really a good strength here to have friendship, and so Solomon is going to keep drawing that attention. So again, Ecclesiastes is a very vast and broad book. There's just a ton to it. All right, there's stuff on money, there's stuff on friendship, there's stuff on relationships, there's even stuff on just being content with what you have. And Solomon is one of those guys, like I said, who had it all. He had all the wisdom, all the stuff, all the things you could possibly desire. And so his credibility is very high in this department. So I'm going to try to finish chapter 4, which is just a few more verses, but I want to stop and take questions or comments before we go any farther. Is your blood still pumping? Is everybody still warm? Pretty sure I saw Emma's breath earlier. It was weird.
Yeah, it was weird for me too.
I was like looking across the room, and I was like, that or she just died, and that was her soul. Emma's soul just left. I'm going somewhere warm.
According to Solomon, it's to the dirt.
It's just in the dirt. Well, I'm sure the ground is a little warmer than this right now. Hey, if two lie together, they have warmth. Okay, so wrapping up. Yeah. All right, finishing this up. Again, that whole section is about friendship and working together. And then let's wrap up. Look at verse 13. Verse 13 is again, he's talked about contentment, and he's talked about cycles, and he's talked about friendship, and now he's coming to a topic he knows a whole lot about because he was a king. And so as you get into verse 13, he says, "Better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished." All right? And he says, "For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor." And so he's painting this illustration. I want you guys to imagine it. He's saying, it's your stereotypical, Prince and the Pauper, except not that story, but you've got your pauper who's coming out of jail, and he's found out to be like, real royalty material. And so this prison bumpkin is being dragged out of the jail cell, and you're like, he's not going to do anything with his life. But he's wise, and he's clever, and he gets himself into the kingship. And so you're like, oh, that's awesome. That's like a real victory story. That's awesome. You got this story of this guy who went from the most unlikely place imaginable to the palace.
Disney.
Yeah, or Joseph. But I mean, but that's what happens. It's your archetype. It happens. You got your pauper to king story that happens. We're all like, yay. But then we've all heard the story of the guy who's like the arrogant prince who thinks he's next in line for the throne, and he gets thrown down for whatever reason, and he never becomes king. And you're like, oh. But that pauper, that's the real hero's tale. But then you apply it to real life people like Jonathan. No, but you think Jonathan, he was a guy who was a prince. He was a guy who would have made an absolutely amazing king. But God said to Saul, because of some of Saul's actions, you and your line are done. And so Jonathan died. And so while there's an arrogant king, we would be like, yeah, your son doesn't deserve to be on the throne. But what if that arrogant king's son is Jonathan? And so Solomon, who would have known these stories, Jonathan was his dad's best friend, like closest of close friends. And so Solomon, who knows if he's thinking about Jonathan in this situation going, what about all those really godly sons of Saul who died because God said, your line's over? What's up with that? And then you got David, who had some really, really ungodly sons, and they died. And Solomon did a lot of ungodly stuff in his life, but he stayed king. So there's things that God can do, but they don't seem to make a whole ton of sense. And that's why we have to trust that God knows what he's doing. And again, he's just using that illustration to basically say, you've got really cool things that happen, really tragic things that happen, and everybody still dies. Verse 15, "And I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them, and also that which cometh after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this is vanity and vexation of spirit." And so the idea here is you've got kingship. Kingship with no wisdom is fleeting, but kingship with wisdom is fleeting. Popularity is fleeting. And so you've got this, it's almost like 15 and 16 are a continuation of the story. It's that's the way some people take it, where you've got the pauper who becomes the king, and then ultimately he does something and gets dethroned, or who knows, but ultimately he's forgotten too. And so even though it's this amazing victory story, you're kind of like, and nobody knows who that guy is, because it's happened over and over and over through history. And so he's just drawing attention to that fact of like, hey, you're popular, people are going to forget you. Hey, you're rich, people are going to forget you. Hey, you built a cool thing, it's going to fall over. And that's why people sometimes look at Ecclesiastes as depressing. It's not trying to be, but it's trying to shock us into thinking properly about some issues. It really is you're coming in for a counseling situation, talking about how terrible your life is, and someone looks at your shoes and says, those are really ugly shoes. And you're like, what? It's like, okay, now that I have your attention. What? And it's just like, he says some things that are just so outside the norm that you're like, wait, what did you just say? Okay, now that I have your attention, let me explain what I meant. Oh, okay. And so he's trying to draw attention to all that. As we continue, we'll go into chapter 5 next week. And so this is where it's going to start to pivot. So up to this point, he's talked a lot under the sun. And as we get into chapter 5, he actually is going to start talking about how you interact with God. And so up to this point, he's drawn attention to all the craziness and insanity in the world. And then as you get to chapter 5, he's still going to talk about all that, but he's going to start bringing up God a little bit more. So that's where we're going. As we wrap up, any questions or comments on this material?